Kia ora koutou to all of those that have joined the Global Perspective webinar, and particularly to the global women that have given up their time, and some of that time's a little bit off, trying to fix up the international clock. But I was just saying to them as we came on board, you know, it's very cool. We can kind of travel the world without leaving home. So look, I'm not going to say much more. We're going to start off with our global women members kind of sharing a macro view of what's happening for them in their kind of own residence, and then we're going to do a little bit more about what's happening at a kind of an organisational level, or at a closer level to that. So look, so Audette's going to start off with sharing what's happening for her.
Thanks, Agnes. Kia ora koutou, all you wonderful Kiwis. I can't see you all. I can see a handful, this wonderful panel, and really glad to be here today to hear these global perspectives. I'm based in Australia, but I have an organisation that works in the developing world, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later, but I'll give you a quick thumbnail sketch of what's going on in Australia and pull out a couple of things that might be interesting. We've got about 26,000 cases happening here, and 19,000 of them are down in Victoria. So we're seeing for the first time really in the history of federation in this country a division between states and lockdowns between states, which is challenging to many Australians and many residents. As well as the public health issues, we're seeing quite an economic crisis as around the world. So we're now officially in recession. Our GDP just drew down about 7%. We expect that that's going to continue. So the twin pillars of a public health crisis and an economic crisis are happening. But overall, I think Australia would say, and Australians would say, they're managing pretty well through the crisis. I think there are a couple of interesting things that are happening here that I thought I might pull out just for people's thinking. When the crisis really began to happen in March and unfold, the Australian government quite brilliantly effectively changed the social contract almost immediately with its citizens and residents, and basically paid people to stay home. And so people went into the first lockdown supportive of what was happening. Now, what's beginning to happen as next steps are becoming quite politicised and the economic piece is starting to hit, is that social contract is being pulled off and changed. And I think that we're watching to see there's a level of unrest, and I don't mean civil unrest, I just mean unrest and discontent arising as the social contract starts to change back. And I think that's going to be quite interesting. The other thing that I'm feeling quite strongly is there's quite a level of denial now beginning to happen because Australia's doing well. It reminds me of Y2K. Was it really real? So a bit of denial and disbelief about how bad the pandemic really is. And when you put that to the increasing politicisation, the conversation is becoming polarised, economy versus biology, which is of course a total nonsense. So that's what we're seeing. And then the final piece I just want to throw into the pot about Australia is we're seeing a very disproportionate impact on women, whether that be violence, whether it be job loss. Across the economy, we're seeing women hit harder, and employment areas that are traditionally gendered towards women are being hit the hardest. And unfortunately, we're seeing a rebuild being a very muscular rebuild. It's very much infrastructure focused. It's very blokey. So I think the conversation here is going to have to focus on gender and issues around women. So that's a very, very quick thumbnail sketch of what's happening in Australia. So I'll throw it back to you, Agnes. I hope that gives you some quick picture of what's going on here.
Thank you, Audette. Karen.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon in New Zealand and everywhere else around the world. Morning, evening, nighttime, very early morning too. So I'm based in Geneva in Switzerland, and I work for the International Air Transport Association. So the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about aviation, which you'll all know is going through quite a lot of challenge at the moment. And whilst I absolutely agree with Agnes's opening comment about how cool it is for us all to be traveling virtually around the world, obviously, professionally, I would love people to be getting back on those planes and actually having that physical connection. But I'll leave that until the second part. Just to give you a very brief overview of the pandemic and how it's impacting Switzerland. I was just going to separate it into the health situation, the economic impact, and then the mood of the people. And hopefully I'll keep to my 3 minutes. So health situation. So As you'll all know, 30th of January, the WHO declared the COVID outbreak as a public health emergency of international concern. And Switzerland actually had its first positive case recorded on the 25th of February. So not long after that WHO declaration. We had the number of daily infections peaked in March, and then significant strict lockdown measures were implemented by the government during that month. And as a result of those measures, there was a dramatic impact on the curve, as we know it to be, and it fell dramatically to now a sustained level of around about 12 through the month of June and July. Since mid-June, however, the daily cases began to creep up across the country to probably wavering now at around just under 500 positive cases a day. And that's mainly it's been attributed to people coming back from high-risk areas, but also, interestingly, the social contact between family members, between work colleagues and private parties. And so quite a lot of attribution is being given to the younger generation, actually, of the increase in the positive cases. Anyway, current situation is that we've got about 45,000 cases that were reported positive. We've had 2,000 deaths since the outbreak. So that represents about 4% of the cases that have tested positive. And of course, the population is tiny. So there's a population of 8.5 million people. So those are the numbers. If we look at the economic impact, so the Switzerland finance minister has warned that a total budget deficit of about 40 billion Swiss francs will exist for 2020. Just on my Google currency converter, that equates to 66 billion NZD. And we are forecasting a recession in 2020. And a recovery into 21, but provided that the virus is brought under control in the next few months. So in total, the government has set aside more than 65 billion Swiss francs, so 107 billion NZD, to support the economy. And that ranges across the board. So it supports small and medium-sized companies, startups, self-employed, and also redundancy insurance and unemployment for workers as well. So one thing that Switzerland is also doing, and you maybe would expect it to do given that it's a hub, particularly Geneva, for international organizations, it's also announced that it is giving 400 million Swiss francs, so 660 NZD million, aid packages to help developing countries during the crisis. And they're doing that by giving interest-free loans to the international organizations like the Red Cross, the IMF, and other international organizations that are based in Geneva particularly, but Switzerland as a whole. So the mood of the people. So what I'd say about that, I mean, I'm based in Geneva, which is a slight bubble, and obviously Switzerland is a bit bigger than just Geneva. But what I would say from my view is that people feel uncertain, people feel worried, people feel frustrated, but actually they also feel okay. They also feel pretty positive, and I'd even suggest some people feel quite optimistic. And just to unpack that slightly, and particularly the positive, okay, optimistic sort of like adjectives, just a couple of things to highlight there, which might be interesting as we look at the perspectives from around the world. I think that's the case because the peak of the pandemic was in March. So that's, you know, in real terms, quite a few months ago. And there was a strict lockdown in the country. The government's approach hasn't been to try to eliminate or to eradicate the virus. It's been to try to manage and control it. So it's certainly not elimination, certainly not herd immunity. So it's sort of like treading that sort of like middle line, if you will. The lockdown had a dramatic effect on flattening the curve. And as such, I think from 27 April, things started to get back to normal, in inverted commas. So by 27 April, all shops, all primary schools, all lower secondary schools were open, restaurants and bars were open, and we started to see a relaxation in travel restrictions already. By the 17th of June, travel became possible in Switzerland within EU. and with the UK. And now we've got a longer list of destinations which it's okay to travel between and to. And then I think just probably about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, the government's advice, which was to work from home, if at all possible, that ended. So it is now up to the employer about whether you can work from home or not. So in summary, all the dates that I've mentioned in real terms were quite some months ago. And so I guess, save for the mandatory wearing of a mask in Switzerland when you are on public transport, things have an air of normalcy because people are back in the workplace, children are back at school and have been for some time. And people are, importantly, and again, probably professionally for me, allowed to travel to different destinations. So I think, I don't know whether, I mean, we'll hear, but I think that maybe that is maybe a differentiator between some of the perspectives that we'll get from other areas. It's back to you, Agnes. That's Switzerland.
That's Switzerland. Hey, thanks, Karen. And we're going to move across to Bronwen in London. Thanks, Bronwen.
Kia ora koutou. Yes, Bronwen Horton. I'm based in London. I work in the financial services industry. So I work for a small investment house in Mayfair. And I joined them actually in lockdown in April. So I'll share a little bit more about that experience. But obviously here in the UK was sort of slow to deal with the pandemic and actually acknowledge what was going on. We were quite late to the party when it comes to actually announcing a lockdown. So ours wasn't until March the 26th. And obviously there was quite a lot of conjecture around whether that should have been a lot earlier when Italy and Spain and France were sort of in the midst of it. Ours has been quite a long lockdown period. So it didn't start to relax until June, with pubs and restaurants, hairdressers opening up in July, and then schools have only just gone back. So they went back. They were allowed to go back slightly just before the summer holidays, but now it is compulsory for them to go back, and that started last week, with the majority of them starting back on Monday. Like many of the other countries, the government obviously gave some sort of relief to employers. We did have a furlough scheme. Not everyone qualified, and unfortunately those who did go on furlough were not actually able to work as well, so it didn't really help a lot of the businesses. So there's been a lot of discussions about how that has been affected businesses as well. So I think what we've got now is a situation where we do have local lockdowns as well. So when we do have spikes in particular cities, and it has been more the Midlands and up north, we've been able to lock down some local areas for weeks at a time. When it comes to obviously the economic side, you've seen quite a disparity as to the industries that have been affected. So like Karen explained, obviously, aviation, tourism, travel, and the entertainment side has really been affected, hospitality as well. And then we've got polar, we've got those that have been actually, extremely obviously the uptake on technology, payment platforms. Any of the online services have done extremely well during the period as well. Economically, obviously, we're heading into recession as well. But like many, I think it's sort of seen that the uptake will be from next year, that this will pick up as well. We do have obviously compulsory face masks on public transport. And in shops and confined spaces, social distancing is obviously in place as well, which is causing quite an impact on businesses as well. Especially those in very small confined spaces. It makes it very hard for them to actually operate as well. A lot have been able to pivot quickly and change their business models. You've seen those businesses that have really been able to do well. If they did close, if they had an online presence, they were able to carry on. But yeah, it's really sort of impacted, and I'm sure this is worldwide, those businesses that rely on foot traffic as well. When we look at the numbers of those actually returning to work, yeah, the message is obviously now, you know, to return to your workplace when it's safe to do so. I think, and like a number of major cities around the world, London really relies on public transport to get people into the cities, into the city centres. So this is obviously quite difficult. London is not sort of set up for you know, commuters on bikes. You know, we do have a very slow sort of start to that, but it is quite difficult. So there is quite a lot of restriction there. A lot of employers have said that they don't want to send their people back to the offices. There's no pressure to go back. So there's sort of a conflicting message. Obviously, the government wants, you know, from an economic perspective, to get people back in, to obviously get, you know, the economy going again. But there's obviously that public safety side of things as well. So yeah, and I'll speak about my own sort of organisation's experience there as well. But yeah, that's the lowdown from London.
Bye, thanks, Bronwen. Amanda.
Kia ora and aloha mai kako, everybody from Hawaii. I am thinking enviously about hairdressers being open. We're in lockdown. We're in lockdown until the 24th of September again, so I'm turning into a light here. But I am with the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, which is a brand new initiative I'll tell you more about in the second section. And I'm also a senior fellow with the East-West Center, which is a public diplomacy center here in Honolulu. And before that, I was ambassador to the UN in Geneva, Karen. So thinking longingly, I was there in early March, actually. We were preparing for the big celebration for the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. And then, of course, the UN went virtual. Jan is nodding away. So everything has changed. And I think it's interesting being in Hawaii because it is very different from the US mainland. It has the lowest death toll. We have 86 deaths so far, 1.5 million population, but around 10,000 cases. And it's been very interesting to see culturally how different Hawaii, which has around 60% Asian population, 20% Native Hawaiian, and about 20% Pakeha or Haole. And the approach is very much collective care, whereas you will have seen in the news the reports of the US mainland, and I know we're going to hear more about that from Sara. It's been much more around individual right not to wear a mask and an anti-science kind of approach. So we've been lucky here in that the culture has been a very respectful culture of community, and mask wearing is something that many Asians do when they're ill anyway. So that transition was very smooth compared to the US mainland. That said, Hawaii, while it may have the lowest deaths, has now the highest RT rate. So it's over 5%. And partly that is due to poorer populations and minority populations. We've seen that in New Zealand too. And here there's around 4% Micronesians who are refugees from bombing and climate change. Many of them do not speak English, are often in crowded conditions and with extended family, 14, 16 people in a 1 or 2 room dwelling. And 4% of the population now account for something like 40% of the cases. So there's a real issue there in paying attention to inequalities which are exacerbated by this kind of crisis. Many of you have mentioned the gender dimension, and I could not help but underscore that. That's a global phenomenon. I sit on the G7 advisory board on gender and women's empowerment. We actually have a meeting tomorrow with the president of the Asian Development Bank and the head of UN Women. And just looking at the data around the world, because this has predominantly impacted service industry, women have been the hardest hit. I saw 90% in New Zealand, which I think is the highest I've seen of any country, but it is very much a trend. We're seeing women also the front line. Women are those majority of healthcare workers, of those who are doing triple care at home if children are not going to school, mine are not, and then often having to look after elderly parents as well as juggling a job. Somebody mentioned the increase in domestic violence rates, which is very concerning. bright spot in Hawaii is that we are the first state to have a feminist COVID recovery plan. We have a very active women's state organization, so that's been exciting to see, and the governor himself has said, yes, we absolutely must do that. Looking globally, McKinsey has come out with some data that shows that $13 trillion could be saved by 2030 if we have a global gender responsive COVID plan. So I think that's a very important data point for us to be remembering. It's not about either we look after people or we look after the economy. It's through taking care of minorities and having a very gender sensitive approach that we're going to be able to do both and. And those of us who are Kiwis are very proud looking at the incredible job that you have all done together as that incredible team of 5 million. Tourism very hard hit, as in New Zealand. We have gone from 2% unemployment pre-pandemic to now around, went up as high as 33%, now back around 24%, but a real concern. And of course, in the US, there is not the same kind of safety net for healthcare or for unemployment benefits as in almost every other developed country. So we're looking sort of down the tunnel to see what's going to be coming down the pike. The amount of money thrown at this has been phenomenal. It's something like 13 trillion globally. The IMF says 9 trillion, depends on whose numbers you use, but this has been a very, very large response. And I think young people are looking at this and saying, wow, everybody said there wasn't enough money to solve the climate crisis, yet we can spend 5 trillion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. And now we've just thrown 13 trillion at building back better. And often that involves rolling back environmental regulations, which I think is of a massive concern. So next round, I'd like to talk a little bit about the advice that we've had from the IMF CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, who says we've actually got to build forward better and use this as a pivot to a green future, because the scientists had been telling us for the last 15 years, we had a 70% chance of a global zoonotic pandemic as a result of our neglect of environmental issues. So I will stop there. It's fantastic to be here with this amazing group of women, and I look forward to the next round. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Jan.
Well, hello, everyone. It's really a delight to be here with this panel. I'm working with the International Development Law Organization, which is an intergovernmental organization. It's devoted to promoting the rule of law and access to justice around the world. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next segment, but I think these issues have been actually brought to the fore by the pandemic. It's headquartered in Rome, but we have offices in all regions. But I'll talk a little bit about Italy. I think that what we all know about Italy is how quickly the pandemic developed there and how chaotic it was and how it got out of control at the beginning. But what has impressed me the most living in Rome is how after a really chaotic start, the government got it together and really listened to the science and the evidence, recognized the complexity, recognized the competing demands of the health sector, of business, and of normal social interaction, and really listened to the professionals. I was in many meetings with senior government officials from health or civil protection, politicians and others, and they were really listening to the professionals, and that's quite different from what I've been seeing. I've been in the US for a lot of the lockdown, working remotely in New York, and one has not seen the same listening by politicians to the professionals. Although I will say in New York, we do have a very sensible governor, and I think that is one of the reasons why New York is now a state where you're seeing very positive trends. It is, as someone said earlier, all about leadership. Just quickly on Italy, I think we all know that 31 January was the first case there. It was a Chinese tourist couple from Wuhan in Rome, and immediately the government on the same day established a state of emergency and stopped all flights to and from China. But from now until then, there have been 279,700 cases and 35,500 deaths. So a very, very serious impact on the country. And clearly, as many say, it may be much higher than that, because the deaths that are registered are often only those that are in hospitals or public institutions, and not necessarily those who die at home. And in Italy, a lot of people died at home. A very key date for Italy was the 19th of February. There was a very major UEFA Champions League football match that day in Milan. It's like an All Blacks test. And there were some 40,000 fans who came from Bergamo. It was between an Italian team from Bergamo and a Spanish team from Valencia. And after that, a month later, there were 7,000 cases in Bergamo and 1,000 deaths. And from that time, the number of deaths just rose exponentially, from something like 500 a day on the 1st of March to, by the 21st of March, 6,500 cases a day. So it just grew. As you all have seen, this health system was completely overwhelmed. ICUs were totally overwhelmed. At least 20–25% of healthcare workers of all kinds were infected. Many deaths. The army had to take coffins from place to place because crematoriums just couldn't deal with it. Funeral homes couldn't deal with it. So it was a terrible situation. The government brought in a lockdown first in the north and then across the whole country, basically overnight on the 9th of March. And that was, I have to say, something that was very strong, because it was a lockdown where you absolutely could not go out of your house apart from the pharmacy or for essential food shopping. All schools closed, all businesses, basically except essential ones, which was very narrowly held, were closed. And the Prime Minister actually said Italy is at war. So it was a very serious situation. I think a crisis that they had not seen since the Second World War. Since that time, as you know, there was a lot of different movement within Italy, but very broadly, by June, businesses began to reopen. In July, we began to reopen to tourism, and new cases by beginning of July had fallen to about 150 a day, and less than 10 deaths a day. And when you think about that and the short period of time, it's pretty amazing. Where are we now? We have a situation, obviously, and I won't go into the economy. It's very similar to what you've heard in other places, devastated, and particularly in the tourism sector, and so many people out of work. A lot of government social security in place. I mean, very different from what we see in the US, but still huge impact on the population, both economically, but also very much emotionally. There's probably no family who has not either lost or known of a loss very close to them. So this, I think, is very touching in the society. The suicide rate is up. There are many other social indicators that you can look at that show that the society has been very deeply affected. After a very good trend in July, in August, September, we're starting to see, again, the numbers go up. It's largely from holidaymakers, they say, coming back from places like Greece and Malta, Spain, and others, up to 1,700 cases a day last week. So it has started really to go up again. There has been not a lockdown, but a closure of some places like nightclubs, masks in the evenings, no large football matches, that's for sure. And there is, I think, though, a much better understanding of what to do. And that, I think, has made people feel worried. Yes, they are worried. Schools are going to start on 14th September. No one knows exactly how it will work. More tourists are coming. People are not sure if this is good or not. So there is a sense, I think, of uncertainty, but also a sense of some optimism, because they have been able to get through it, and the social cohesion has been very high. But they're very clear that they must be vigilant. And as you know, we're in the Northern Hemisphere and will be coming into the flu season. That is another reason why we must be vigilant. Many are still remote working. As I said, schools are about to start. So I would say the situation here is a cautious optimism. Thank you.
Oh boy, thank you, Jan. Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm calling in from Los Angeles. I'm actually based in San Francisco, but I feel a little bit like I'm dialing in not from a different country, but from a different planet right now. Northern California, in addition to having been ravaged by the pandemic, we now have very, very bad wildfires as an ongoing issue that has been accelerating over the last few years. And the air quality got bad enough that my husband and I decided to drive down to Los Angeles, and so we are holed up in a hotel, hence the slight mood lighting on this call. So in terms of the US experience, it really, I think, has been one of the grimmest stories globally in terms of both the consequence of the pandemic and how it's been handled. And it really is a story of where in the country do you live and the challenges of having federal jurisdiction. And so it's felt a bit like a lottery in terms of what your experience of COVID would be. So based in San Francisco, our mere London breed, a little bit like Jacinda, went early, went hard. And so in the first week of March, we went into full lockdown and, you know, everything shut, all businesses shut. You were not allowed outside your house without a mask. You could not go any further than 6 feet towards somebody without a mask. And only essential services, which was pharmacies, food and the like, were opened. We're 6 months on and we are basically in not a dissimilar situation. So, you know, at the moment in the US, they've had over 6 million cases. That's widely considered to be materially underreported because there is a real dearth of testing still to this day. There's 190,000 deaths that have occurred now, and we're still seeing over 40,000 cases a day and 700 deaths a day. Now, that changes state by state and has done through the summer, depending on the nature of the lockdowns that you've seen in place. Currently, the worst of it is being borne by the states in the middle of the country. And so, you know, much as Jan said, New York, through its response from its governor, is now in a very good position. California has continued to sort of maintain a sort of middle of the line position, had certain counties where things have become problematic, where they have gone against the governor sort of rules around what you can do with social distancing. You've seen real hotspots. And then you have other states where it's just, you know, no holds barred. You know, so you see people at the beaches in Florida, you know, in Louisiana, they had the Mardi Gras. And it's just extraordinary watching that from different states and seeing the infection rates that inevitably occur when you get that kind of lack of social distancing and protocols in place. I think, you know, we're seeing similar economic impacts as the rest of the world. Unemployment's been at 10% for a number of months now. And it's really unclear what the long-term impact is going to be on the economy. It's a bit of a story of two halves. I work in the technology industry, so I'm the chief operating officer at Twitch. And, you know, we and our parent company, Amazon, are obviously doing very well, as you've seen, both economic activity and then social community and entertainment move online. What we are seeing is that small businesses, which require in-person engagement, so, you know, hair salons, gyms, restaurants, those are all still shut. They have not been open for over 6 months now. And so we have seen in San Francisco, for example, over 30% of restaurants have closed permanently. And we are expecting to see an acceleration of that over the next few months as effectively businesses run out of money. There is pretty material social unrest at this point across the country as well, and that's really feeding into that sense of volatility as we come into the November 2020 election. So it's sort of the perfect storm of situations. You've got, you know, climate control issues with wildfires, you know, up and down the West Coast. You've got this pandemic which has not been handled at all well, you know, either at a federal or state level in many instances. These social issues such as Black Lives Matter, which have created rioting, and now we're coming into an election with, you know, a president which is, you know, basically denying all of the standard rules of engagement about how the leader of a first world nation would behave with respect to, you know, basic truths and sharing of real information about what the situation is. In terms of the impact on women, the most meaningful aspect in the sort of environments that I operate in, which is sort of very much the sort of tech community, is that there is a very material backward slide for women by virtue of the fact that they are getting this crunch around both schooling not going back, and so they're trying to homeschool their families, where you have dual parent households. The women are bearing a disproportionate burden on the domestic front, and we are seeing an unprecedented number of women looking for, you know, accommodations in terms of the way that they work. And you're now seeing articles like this is effectively taking a generation of women back in terms of what they are able to do from a career perspective, and what that will mean for the next 10 or 20 years in terms of women in leadership, which is a very disturbing outcome. And when you think about some of the articles you see globally about the fact that indeed it is the female leaders, both of countries and companies, who have in many instances led through these crises more effectively. So, you know, it's certainly the most fluid situation that I've seen in my career. I worked in Europe for a number of years through both the financial crisis and the first .com boom. This is really unprecedented.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to you all, actually. I mean, when you read about it in the media, but I must admit, when you show up like this and you listen to you all, it is really, you know, there's some really sobering thoughts. But again, you know, there is that optimism. What I want to just say to those that are online is that if you do have some questions, we are going to take them at the end. If you can just put them in the chat box, that would be great. And look, we're going to just be a little bit fluid with the time, because this is too interesting to kind of work between a set time. Kate, our event manager, probably is sitting in the background thinking, Agnes. But anyways, we're going to go on to the second part, and there, as they described in the beginning, they're going to delve a little bit kind of into closer to home for what's going on for them. So again, we'll just, if we do the same way, Audette, thank you.
Sure, thanks so much. That was fascinating spin around the world. Okay, I think we've got two questions to whip through in about 3 minutes here. The first is what's happening in our organisations, and the second is what's happening where our organisations work globally. So I'll try to just give you a quick spin on that for Adara. My organisation is 22 years old. I guess loosely I'm a social entrepreneur, and it's a bit of a weird organisation in that it's a fairly large international not-for-profit, but at its centre I have two corporate advice businesses that I use, if you like, as the funding engine to fund the work that we do in the developing world. So I'm kind of Wall Street to Back Street. So the organisation, I get to watch across very different parts of the world and the economy. Loosely, just so you get a sense of it, the work on the INGO is focused on two areas of specialty: maternal, newborn, child health, but particularly care to preterms and low birth weight babies in places without consistent electricity supply. So we work in centres of excellence. So that work for us exhibits through Uganda and East Africa. We're on the National Newborn Steering Committee in Uganda, and we've been there for 22 years. And again, loosely, remote community development, health and education work in very remote places. And so our remotest project, that work exhibits around Nepal. So we're 25 days walk from a road in terms of our most remote project. And the business, as I said, that are the funding engines, M&A, equity capital markets, debt capital markets advisors in the Australian listed markets. So in terms of the impact this has had on the organisation, obviously the impact was enormous, particularly to begin. And I can truly say without our business model, we wouldn't still be standing. There's a piece to pull out about what's happening in the not-for-profit sector and the charity sector. We do have wonderful donors. So we've put about $50 million to work over the years we've been doing this, and about 17's come from the business. The rest has come from amazing donors. And we lost nearly $1 million of that in the first 6 weeks, committed donations. So many not-for-profits really suffering. The business was a scary time on the business when everything dried up, but what's happened for us is that the business kind of stepped forward, and we've been pegged in on the boards of advising the boards of some of Australia's top 10 companies, as well as top 100 companies. And so that funding engine, that part of our model has really worked. In terms of the work on the ground, I've got large teams on the ground. It's a personal KPI for me to get all my staff through this alive. We realised in the early days we had to throw the plan out completely, the 2020 plan. So we chucked out the 2020 plan and we wrote a brand new plan around the world, and we ran it. We ran the planning sessions based on what are the tools in our toolkit. how can we deliver service? Now we work across child protection, health, education, and we're now doing a lot of food security work as we see massive food insecurity. And it was actually a really interesting process to work with a team of international development experts on the ground, as well as we have offices in Seattle, Montana, Australia, supporting them, figuring out how to change service delivery when you can't physically be present. I'm very proud of the plan and the work that we're doing. And so we're deep into that work. We've put millions of dollars to work this year with our teams. So to give you a sense of how it's unfolding in the communities, in Uganda, our Centre of Excellence is in a catchment area of it's a hospital, 30-acre hospital site, million people pour into it. It's the maternal newborn Centre of Excellence for the whole country. It's remote. We have COVID at the heart of the hospital now. We have many of our health workers are COVID positive. We've only seen reported 3,700 cases, but to sort of contextualise it for you, the public health system is already breaking. In the government health system, there's a complete lack of PPE. People are almost crawling to get up to this remote hospital to get some kind of care. When we look at projections, the University of Washington Institute for Health Metrics, with who we do a lot of, we focus a lot on our relationship with UW, just put some projections out to give you a sense of what we're preparing for at the moment. They are projecting that we will have 17,500 COVID deaths by January, and more than 24,000 if they start to ease any restrictions and they're under tough lockdown, and that daily deaths are going to peak by November at about 500 a day, and daily infections are going to be about 410,000 a day by November. All hospital beds nationally will be needed, required and used by November. And this is just to give you the context for what it's like to work with the extreme poor. We don't have supplemental oxygen. We don't have ventilators. Our hospital is better equipped than many because of our deep partnership with them. But it's going to get very, very grave in the developing world, as you can see already. It is in places like India. A couple of other things to pull out in terms of what's happening with the work generally, but also Uganda. Essential service delivery is breaking down. We expect, and the secondary impacts are starting to rise. So we're lack of vaccinations, lack of early treatment, women not being able to get to skilled birth attendants. We're seeing all of that. And we're also seeing some really frightening secondary impacts that we're now turning our minds to. Rise in teen pregnancy is massive. We're seeing girls trading sex, unprotected sex for food. And this is in a community, well, the community we work in, we've got 12% positive HIV patients. So you can imagine, so we're pivoting a lot of our work to focus on these secondary impacts. Quickly to whip you to Nepal, beautiful Nepal. We're projecting, based on what UW's telling us, probably another 13,000 COVID deaths by January. They're going to peak just after Uganda, and daily deaths peaking at about 500 a day, and they're expecting daily infections to be about 300,000 a day by the time we get to the end of the year. And same thing, all hospital beds will be used by December. They're under very strict lockdown in Kathmandu, not so much in the villages. One of the big things we're seeing there is girls out of school. So we work in 16 schools, and the data, when you start to look at girls, the longer they're out of school, the harder it is to get them back, the more likely it is they'll marry as a teen or be pregnant as a teen. So we're gravely concerned about the impact on girls and young women the longer this goes. Another secondary impact, just to pull that out for you to give you a sense of it, the maternal mortality rate in Nepal has doubled since the first lockdown in April. And this is because women cannot get to skilled birth attendants. So I guess if I pull it all together, what I'd say is we're not hearing the voices of the developing world so much. We need to be hearing them. We need to be very heartening to hear Geneva and the aid package. I believe we're going to see some terrible cuts to overseas development assistance. Maslow's hierarchy of needs as we start to become less generous, not more generous. But if there's one thing that this is really showing us is that we're all connected. One world, you know, one public health system. And this virus is not going to be over for any of us until it's over for everybody. So very quick skate into the developing world.
Thanks, Audette. Karen.
Thank you, Agnes. Wow, Audette, that was great and sobering. and everything else all at the same time. So thank you for that whistle stop, because I think you're right. We don't know, and we underestimate the developing world, the impact that COVID is having. Certainly, you know, from an aviation perspective, we know that it is not great in the developing world. We know the access to capital and things like that, which are allowing our more European or, you know, more developed nations' airlines to survive, is just not available in Africa and other developing countries. So that was very, it's very pertinent. So thank you for that. So for me, so like Audette, IATA is a not-for-profit organization. It's a trade association which represents the world's commercial airlines. So currently, and it will change, we currently represent around 300 of the global commercial airlines. So a very truly global organization. What I wanted to do was to first give you an insight into the COVID issues that are affecting aviation globally, and then have a very quick look at IATA and the organization I work for itself and the impacts of COVID there. So firstly, on the macro global aviation, well, I'm sure you're all aware, COVID has had an unprecedented impact on the aviation industry, economically, operationally, and socially. And for the first time since 1944, which was essentially the start, if you will, or the recognized start of commercial aviation with the Chicago Convention, this is the first time that we're having to restart an industry, which is effectively, and I don't underscore this at all, it is on its knees. And we are having to bring back flying, domestic and international, to the world. And the fact is that notwithstanding the start of the pandemic at the early part of this year, and the peak, which has been sort of like a wave throughout the world, the industry is still on its knees. And the road to recovery is a very, very long one ahead. So just, I wanted to give you some stats to underscore and to illustrate the enormity of the situation. So the first one is, we are forecasting a net loss for the industry in 2020 of between 80 and 90 billion US dollars. Now, this reflects a US billion 312 decline in passenger revenue for our global airlines in 2020 compared to 2019. 21 looks better, but then I guess everything's relative, and we are again forecasting a net loss for the industry of around 15 billion US dollars next year. Passenger traffic volumes are forecast not to return to 2019 levels until at least 2024. So a year later than was actually forecast at the beginning of the crisis. So that's some way off, but actually as we move through this crisis, we are extending the forecasts out. So that is not the way that we would obviously want it to be. So on top of all that revenue decline and everything else, what we've also seen, and you'll be very well aware of, is that with all the government bailouts that have happened with the airlines and the equity that is being put into airlines to keep them alive, there is a projected 120 billion US dollars of new debt that now sits with the industry. And that is just frankly unsustainable, because given the long road of recovery, airlines are going to have problems with cash flow, they're going to have weak or low operating revenue, and yet they still have to service, in many cases, massive debts that they have accumulated throughout this crisis. And as I say, many to keep them alive, but how long can that last? So we do expect that there will be airlines who will struggle to service that debt, and we do expect there to be a number of failures of airlines between now and the end of the year. And like everywhere you've seen, but I think probably the headlines have grabbed it, the amount of layoffs, the amount of redundancies of airline staff has been absolutely eye-watering, and that has been quite consistent across the globe, stretching from, you know, in New Zealand with obviously Air New Zealand, my ex-employer, through to, you know, the biggies like United, American over in the US. So IATA's role is threefold in this crisis. The first is to support and assist the airlines to survive and to get through the crisis, and it's doing that by lots of activities to reduce the costs for airlines and to increase their cash. And that is through financial relief, as I've talked about, government bailouts. It's through operational charges reductions, and it's through regulatory advocacy. The second thing that IATA's role is to do is to safely restart the industry. And this is the biggest issue. So it's about getting borders open. It's about getting planes back up in the sky. And it's about getting passengers back into those planes. And then the third issue for IATA is about thinking, and I think Amanda mentioned it actually, the catchphrase around building back better. IATA has a role to think further than the COVID crisis and to think about how we can build back better for the industry once COVID has had its day, if you will. And I truly believe, and back to what Amanda said actually on the environmental piece, I truly believe that there are now opportunities that have arisen from COVID that actually haven't been there before and are an enabler for us to accelerate some things that previously we have been unable to get traction with, or things have moved very slowly. And one of those key areas I truly believe is the environmental piece. We all know that airlines are polluters. We can't get away from that. We've been fiddling around the edges with sustainable aviation fuels for years, and it hasn't got the traction. But now, suddenly, I think COVID, one silver lining, is given, that the economies will be looking to recover, we are advocating for governments to directly invest into SAF development, into SAF plants, so that actually we can increase the amount of SAF that is used by airlines to get to that tipping point that then it becomes more of a BAU thing to do. So I think there are some opportunities for the industry out of this terrible, terrible situation. Anyway, so that's the envelope we're working in. It's difficult, not to underscore it too much. It's difficult because the industry is truly global, and as you know, states and countries are implementing things in different ways. And whilst we need a harmonized approach, particularly to opening of borders, countries are relying upon their sovereignty to do things in their own way, because they have one focus, which is to protect the public which exist in their countries. So that's difficult. Second difficulty is, well, we haven't done this before since 1944, so it's all brand new. The third thing that's really difficult is, even if we get governments to harmonize how they do things, we've got to win the hearts and minds of the passengers, the people, to get back onto those planes. And we somehow have to restore the confidence in the traveling public to, think that flying is actually okay. The transmission in flight and the transmission from country to country, and aviation being a vector of it, it's okay. And that's a difficult, difficult task. And then the final thing, why it's so difficult, and particularly to the point about building back better, is that what I'm seeing is that when you're in the eye of the storm, which all the airline CEOs and exec teams are, it's bloody difficult to think beyond to building back better, because you're surviving day to day and trying to keep your people safe, your people employed, and your operations going. So whilst it's difficult, we're getting on with it. We've got a plan. And we're executing that. And the key thing around that is what's become very clear to me, to IATA, to our stakeholders and partners, is no one can do this alone. It is a real collaboration of effort across the complete ecosystem of aviation. So we are now working much better, much more with all of our industry partners, and also with governments, health organizations, and also people from different industries, because it's affecting them too. It's a real, I think, difference from previously where, issues were localized in particular countries. What COVID has done is to unite everybody in this absolute horror. And so everybody, I think it was said before, needs to work together to actually come out of it. And then finally, very quickly, IATA. Well, IATA is a microcosm of what's happening in the industry. Like Audette said, we've chucked out the 2020 business plan and the strategy. We've had to put a new one in place. Our revenue has flatlined. We have got a significant restructure, which we have announced and we are just about to implement. So, you know, we are feeling it as much as everybody else. As I say, it is a long road ahead. It is really difficult to be in this industry at this time. We foresee things getting more difficult before they get better, but I am absolutely heartened by and will hold on to the fact that out of this, there will be opportunities to create a better aviation ecosystem for everyone.
Kia ora, Karen. Bronwen, if you don't mind, Sarah's having to take another international call, so we're going to ask Sara to follow Karen. Thanks, Bronwen. Thanks, Sara.
Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it. So, as I said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Twitch. For those of you who are not familiar, it's a live streaming service where content creators stream and form communities. And so for those of you who have children who are interested in gaming, you may be aware of personalities like Ninja who do this. They form very deep communities who will watch them in many instances for hours a day. And the way that I think about it is for Gen Z and millennials, it's effectively their equivalent of live television. And it's a sort of interactive community-based live television. I'm also on a couple of boards here in the United States, and what we are seeing in the technology space is that the pandemic has really jumped us forward 5 years. So just this surge of interest in online services, people social distancing and looking for community through online interactions, transacting online and doing more of their sort of standard day-to-day activities, whether that be shopping, ordering pharmaceuticals, all of those types of things have moved online. And, Twitch certainly has been in the very lucky position of seeing a material surge in both our audience and the number of content creators we have who are streaming. So at the peak of the pandemic, we were seeing 50% month-on-month growth. And, we certainly expect to see close to 100% year-on-year growth relative to 2019. The nature of our service means that the bonds that are created between these communities are very durable. So when they are established, which it does take some time, it's like becoming familiar with a talk show host or your favorite commentator on a sports show. Once you develop a relationship with that style of entertainment, people will come back to it. And so our expectation at this point is that actually these bonds will sustain post social distancing, and that you will see this kind of step change in the nature of the way that people think about looking for entertainment online. In terms of the economic impact, we certainly did see some short-term pressure, primarily related to the fact that a material proportion of our revenue comes from advertising. And obviously a lot of businesses globally just put their foot on the brake with marketing dollars at the beginning of the pandemic, while they really understood what it meant and what it was going to mean for their business through 2020. We've been very lucky. Our advertising team pivoted quite quickly to go towards television dollars. And what we saw was that there were quite a lot of dollars available from live events. So, cancellations of things like the Olympics, where you had major brand sponsors that were looking for ways to connect with communities. And so we've really been thinking about, how do we shift the nature of the way we think about engaging with brands and with advertisers. And it's, again, accelerated our push into claiming those television dollars, whereas previously we were primarily focused on digital dollars. Our other major revenue stream is what we refer to as subscriptions and bits. So these are effectively donations that the community makes to the streamer. So we have almost 4 million streamers on Twitch, and the community is about 150 million. We have about 17.5 million people who watch Twitch daily for about an hour a day. So it really does have a lot of parallels to live television. And the viewers actually donate to the streamer. So the streamer almost operates like a small business, and these donations form the nature of subscriptions or the use of virtual goods in the stream to cheer. And that business has been an absolute incredible growth vector for us this year. At first, we felt that the impact of the recession and unemployment may impact the likelihood of our audience in actually continuing with these kinds of donations, we have seen quite the opposite behavior, which is that people are looking for micro treats. They're looking for small ways to spend a few dollars and get a moment of interaction or community or enjoyment out of it. And that these moments of community interaction really, provide that for them. And so they're not spending $5 on a Starbucks coffee because they can't go out, Starbucks isn't open. And instead what they're doing is creating and forging these bonds online. The last aspect from a business perspective is we have seen a step change in the nature of the streamers who are broadcasting on Twitch, particularly in music. So industries that have been very heavily impacted, like music, where the live events industry has basically just collapsed globally. Those musicians are now looking for ways to connect with their fans online. And we are seeing strong live events activity. A good example is a San Francisco festival that normally has about 200,000 people attend. We had over 3 million people watch it when we broadcasted online last weekend. And so it's really unlocking some interesting new revenue opportunities for the creative class. And I think you'll see those sustain as we come out the other side of the pandemic. The last point I wanted to make sort of from a team perspective, because I lead all of our go-to-market and corporate functions, everything that's not product and engineering. So I run teams in 25 countries around the globe. And a lot of the effort that we have been making over the last 6 months is how do we create a healthy and sustainable way for our teams to operate in a work from home world. We are not anticipating that we will return to the offices pre the end of 2022. So really that there will need to be a scaled vaccine before we feel comfortable doing that. We have opened our offices for people who feel that they do not have a safe or productive environment that they can work from for home. We are seeing less than 2% of our population elect to use those offices. And so we really feel like this is, again, a step change shift in terms of thinking about, where do we recruit from a talent perspective? There's been a lot of economic disparity and participation in the technology industry over the last decade, because in order to work for a lot of the major firms, you needed to be able to move to a city, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, New York, some of the European hubs. And what we are seeing now with work from home is that those boundaries have collapsed, and we are as likely to hire somebody working in New Zealand as we are to hire somebody working in San Francisco. And I think that is a really huge potential shift for us in terms of we think about diversity in the technology industry. And so I think that is actually a potential silver lining as we think about some of these work from home behaviors. We have spent a lot of time thinking about how do we support in particular the different types of people that we have working for Twitch. So we have, a lot of parents, we have singletons who are living in a studio apartment by themselves. These people all need very different things from us as a company. Parents are looking for, time off in the middle of the day so that they can feed their family lunch. The people who are in a apartment by themselves, quite opposite, they're craving social interaction. They miss being in the office with their colleagues, and we're seeing quite high levels of anxiety and stress related disorders from that lack of social interaction. And so we have started providing free counseling and a range of other services to help those different groups within our organization. The most challenging aspect that we have right now is maintaining connections with global teams. I used to travel 20 weeks a year to our various offices around the globe, and as I sit here past 11 p.m. in the West Coast and then start doing calls with EMEA first thing, it's just much easier when you can be in the same time zone as people for a week, and you're actually there immersively alongside them. And so, that is a nut that we have yet to crack in terms of how do we create sustainable global connections and practices. So on that note, I will leave you to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much. It's been delightful to be on with such an incredible panel of women.
Thank you, Sarah. Please stay safe.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bronwen.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It's absolutely fascinating listening to everyone's organisations and how this has impacted. as I alluded to earlier, I changed, I went back to my roots as a financial advisor at the beginning of the year, and I'd secured a contract with a new organization. And obviously then the pandemic hit, and I was meant to start on April the 6th. And I guess that was quite a nerve-wracking period, knowing that, would they defer a start date? What did that look like? Luckily for me, the organisation has been absolutely amazing. They are a small, privately family-run investment house in Mayfair, with branches throughout London, and about 400 staff. And pre-pandemic, they had never had a situation of being able to work from home. Half of our organisation is investment managers. They're watching the markets every day. And I think to Sarah's point, they hadn't quite looked at the ways of working and whether it would be effective working from home. But literally overnight, they picked up their laptops and went home. I had my laptop delivered, the Friday, started on the Monday, and I'm now 5 months into working from home for an organisation that, I've only met a handful of people who have interviewed me. And I guess, the response from the business has been fantastic. They've been extremely supportive. All of our partners took a pay cut rather than doing redundancies and furlough. They wanted to make sure that everyone was kept working, basically to help with career progression more than anything, and also client workload as well. We thought we would see a dip in client work. So I work on the planning and the wealth side of the business, and actually we've seen a real increase from people being quite concerned about their finances going forward, very concerned obviously about the impact of should they pass away or should they be, made redundant. So we've seen a lot of an increase in, clients wanting to discuss this with us. I think from the client perspective, it's been quite interesting. A lot of older clients have found it quite difficult to deal with technology. If they've had people, younger family members who could help them get online, it's been a lot easier. But we have done everything by telephone. But I do think that there are a lot of clients who have put things on hold, waiting for us to get back into the office so that they can come and see us face to face. At this stage, although our office did open on Monday, we won't be opening up for client meetings, not until we'll reassess it at the end of October and sort of see what the sort of feeling is from our clients. We're doing a number of surveys just to sort of see, what the sort of feeling would be to whether they would feel comfortable coming into the office. So we'll be very guided by our clients. Those that have obviously grasped technology, our younger clients, our ones who probably are working professionals, who are using WebEx, Zoom, on a, conference calls on a day-to-day basis, they feel very comfortable with that. But then, there are others that are sort of still trying to get a handle on what that looks like. A lot of obviously our staff as well. Some were quite happy. Obviously, I'd come from an organisation. I come from Bank of America, which, a multinational. We worked from home 2 days a week. We're quite used to actually working on, global teams, and the like, to going to an organisation that wasn't used to that. So obviously, I could share a lot of learnings and that sort of situation and help them. Although I'd never actually been in a situation where I'd worked 5 days, every day a week at home, which I think has its challenges. I think Sarah brought that up as well. We've got a lot of our younger, junior members who are, they're flat sharing, they're sitting in their room, they have done, for 5 months, trying to work and live from their flat, from their, very small bedroom. So I think in saying, the way that we're going to work is obviously going to change. I think there will be a big blended approach, but actually I think, there'll be situations where we really do need to jump on a plane at some stage and actually be in different locations. I think this sort of feels like a little bit of a temporary situation, to be honest, and we're holding on and we're getting through it. but I don't think it's going to be, you know, it won't be, we won't all be working from home for the rest of our working days. I think there will be some sort of blended approach. I think on the working families, you know, we've seen a lot of our women very heavily be impacted by COVID. They have been homeschooling, you know, have been homeschooling right up until sort of July, and that has had its impacts as well. The organisation has been totally flexible. You know, they've sort of said, you know, do your calls, do your client work in and around your lifestyle. So I think, and already we're starting to do a lot of report writing around, and actually doing a lot of surveys as to how do we take what we've, you know, the good parts of what we've learned from lockdown and the pandemic, how do we take that into our working lives going forward? So I think, you know, there's going to be some really great opportunities coming out of this. So also from the client perspective, we had, so part of our organisation not only is just advising clients on their wealth, but we also have a tax and trusts and wills section, estate section of our business, and we've had 3 COVID deaths of our clients. So we've had 3 estates to administer. We had one situation where one lady's will, she needed to have her body returned to Ireland to be buried, which was quite an interesting situation. Is she also didn't have a passport, and of course for you know, the airline situation, they actually need a passport for the body. They had to get a special dispensation to actually get the body back, because there was no way that they were going to get a passport. It's been really interesting that these situations have come up. Obviously, you know, things like, you know, administering and you know, witnessing wills has had to change. You know, there's been quite a lot of change that's occurred, and almost not done on the fly, but you know, just to deal with the situations. Then obviously now retrospectively we need to go back and actually look at, you know, making sure that these things have been done within the legal frameworks as well, so that they stand up, you know, stand the test of time down the track. From the markets perspective, obviously, you know, we saw a massive dive in February and March, and we've actually seen quite a big upturn as well. So I think it's been quite interesting. Obviously, the phones have been really busy from clients. You know, they're worried, they're very stressed about their personal situations, they're worried about their work situations. We're probably, you know, here in the UK, we're going through massive, you know, restructures. It is polar, you know, depending on the type of industry as to redundancies, but we're probably getting, you know, daily redundant, you know, clients being made redundant as well, and making sure that they have the financial plans in place to deal with that as well. And I guess then from a wider perspective, the other hat that I wear is I also run the founder and chair of the New Zealand Businesswomen's Network here in London. So we have 2,000 women here in London, and we're quite heavily involved in the New Zealand community. I think over the years we've really forged quite a really strong relationship here in London. I think it all really started with the Christchurch earthquakes. And we've gone from there. So we've been meeting monthly, you know, right throughout the pandemic, making sure that some of our older people in the network are well looked after. So we have a women's association as well. They have 300 members who are quite elderly, and you know, they've been really concerned because a lot of them would obviously go back to New Zealand in summer. You know, not being able to obviously travel, you know, during that sort of period, it was quite disconcerting for a lot of New Zealanders as well. I guess we always I think see ourselves as you know, global travelers, but also knowing that we can always go home if we need to. And I think, you know, for a period that was sort of taken away, and it is quite difficult for a lot of people, knowing that they can't quickly jump on a plane and go home, even though it's 24 hours to get home. It's still, you know, I think it's something that we sort of hold quite dearly to us as well. So that's been quite interesting. We have had quite a lot of people return to New Zealand because either businesses have literally had to, you know, overnight been taken away, you know, especially those in the events and hospitality. If they were just venue based. It's been quite difficult for them. Those that have been able to have that online business on the side, I think have fared a lot better. But we'll probably see, a fair few, even though there are quite a lot of heavy measures in place when you do return to New Zealand. I think there will be quite a few who do return home. I think there will be those that do stick it out if they're in industries that sort of stand up as well. So yeah, I think that's a good summation of London.
Thanks, Bronwen. Amanda.
Awesome, so many fascinating different perspectives. Well, Julie Wrigley has her Global Institute of Sustainability, which is what I originally joined, at a university called Arizona State, which I'm sure none of you have heard of. I had not, but it is the largest university in the US, and it is #1 for innovation, with Stanford at #2 and MIT at #3 for 5 years in a row. And tomorrow, you heard it here first, the new Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab is launching with a mission of no less than saving the planet and trying to bring together this notion of societal boundaries and planetary boundaries. And I want to pick up on points that everyone has made. So Audette talked about us being totally interconnected, and we're not safe until everybody's safe. And I would like us to think about that in the climate perspective, right? We are not safe until everybody's safe. And I think the other concept which Jan mentioned was the exponentiality. Took 100 days for the first 1 million COVID cases. Now we're seeing 1 million cases in 2 days. So that hockey stick curve is exactly the same with climate change. And we have 7.5 years of carbon budget left. So while many governments are behaving as though this is a black swan, one-off event, as astrophysicist Adam Frank has pointed out in an excellent piece, COVID is just a fire drill for climate change. And I think for we as New Zealand global women leaders really need to be thinking up and out and beyond this small circumstance. So when we look at the warnings that scientists have been making, and in fact, scientists have been talking into the void pretty much, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone. When I was ambassador in Geneva, we thought, oh, those climate ambassadors, they do their thing over there and it's 50 years away. And in fact, that exponential curve is working its way through, and I see Jan nodding, having been our Undersecretary General at the UN. This is something that we really need to think about, and it's planetary and it's human. So what can we do as individuals? And so fascinating to hear from Karen and Bronwen and from Audette and Sara, just how businesses are pivoting. And I think this is really, how do we build forward better? How do we take a leaf out of the IMF CEO's book and think about using this time to really pivot? And I think New Zealand is seen as a role model in so many places, but I would love to see New Zealand be a little stronger on this even than it is. If we look right now, we have an estimated, with the fires that are going on in the Arctic, 6 meters sea level rise. So everything is changing. All the equations are changing. And I guess just to quickly finish off, because we could all talk for ages, is just with education. So ASU was already online. There's 170,000 online students, and they have a whole lifelong learning program with Starbucks and Uber and others. So just the recognition that, as we heard from Twitch and Sara, there's this whole new world of online is being accelerated. And ASU rapidly developed a saliva test. Staff and students can be tested every day if they like. So I think it's this real interface with how do we harness the incredible knowledge that we have, and how do we also think about pivoting in a way that brings everybody along. We've seen this pandemic exacerbate inequalities. How do we switch that and think about a global perspective where everybody can thrive? And I'm just thrilled that that is really the aim of the new Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab launching tomorrow. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Amanda. Jan.
Well, I think so much has been said. Maybe I'd just say a few things personally for me. I was elected to be the Director General of this organization at the end of last year. So I began in January with an organization which is global, and where I was expecting to travel to all of the different locations where we are working, and I was expecting, as all of you were, to have a 2020 business plan, which was quite different from what actually transpired, because as I said before, by the 9th of March, Rome was in a total lockdown, and we had to overnight move everyone to remote working. Overnight, the schools closed. Overnight, everybody's at the headquarters situation changed, but also the situation of most of our colleagues around the world also changed. So we had to immediately think differently about our business continuity plans, which were pretty rudimentary, I might say, much better now, I think, and move to remote working, which I have to say has worked relatively well, although it is incredibly intense. I think that, if you have a global organization, you are online most of the day and the night, and it all sort of merges together, and there isn't much difference between home and work at all. But I feel that a good side of this has been an interconnectedness amongst all of us in the organization wherever we sit, perhaps even more so than in the past. For me, one of the biggest challenges has been the governance of the organization. When you are dealing with member states, and usually you have a lot of time to meet with them and to be able to discuss the different positions with them. When you have to do all of that virtually, and particularly when you haven't even necessarily made all those contacts because you're new and you haven't met them in person, it's much more difficult. But again, it's been working. I think that what I would really like to emphasize is everybody has, from their different perspectives, that this is just such a huge global crisis. And it's a crisis, I would say, of so many dimensions: political, humanitarian, economic, and social. And it's really a crisis that traditional policymaking, whether it's at the international level, where I've worked for a long time, or whether it's at the national level or the local level, whether it's governmental or whether it's private sector or non-profit, our governance systems are not well equipped to deal with this type of crisis. And as everyone has said, we know, and I think we will increasingly see, as Audette has mentioned, that this crisis has really exposed the inequalities in our world, and has definitely and is definitely impacting the poorest and most vulnerable. There is no question the effect we are seeing on the poor, on women and girls in many societies, refugees, migrants, LGBT, people living with HIV, people who are vulnerable in different societies are those who are being the most affected. We're also seeing the fragility in countries also being exacerbated. So we have just seen, for example, one of the countries where we're working, a coup in Mali. It would have probably happened, but it wouldn't have happened in quite the same way probably without COVID. In so many of the areas where we're working, the fragility is increased by the fact of the pandemic. What we are doing as an organization is really looking at three major areas. Firstly, we looked at strengthening the legal and policy frameworks of countries to deal with emergencies, in this case to deal with COVID and to deal with the aftermath. We work both top down and bottom up. So we work with governments, we work with all levels of the justice chain, so whether it can be police, it can be legal community, judiciaries, legal aid, and we work with communities and civil society to make the bridge between communities and the justice sector. We're working right now, for example, with WHO to ensure that countries are able to put in place public health measures that respect human rights. We're working with FAO to look at emergency regulations and how they affect the right of access to food. And I think we've all seen that one of the effects of this pandemic has been a massive food crisis. It's I think a major food shortage in so many countries in the world. The second area we're looking at is particularly how to mitigate the impact of the crisis on justice systems and also on vulnerable persons. In terms of systems, we're working a lot in e-justice, and we were doing this before the pandemic. It has been very much advanced, and in many developing countries where access to justice has been almost completely denied because of the pandemic, this has become very important. Digitalizing information systems and strengthening different parts of the justice system. However, technology, as we all know, is major in this, but the digital divide is very much there. And this has also exposed, I think, some elements of that divide, which are particularly harmful. And again, here, women and girls are often those who are the most disadvantaged. Coming to women and girls, we have seen also a major rise in sexual and gender-based violence throughout the world. This is an area that we are working on, looking both at the immediate, shelters for victims, this type of thing, but also integrating gender perspectives into legislative frameworks. We're working in places as diverse as Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Myanmar, Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, and in all of these places you'll find discriminatory laws which are being, in many cases, used even more draconianly during this pandemic. A lot of governments are using this crisis to impose different types of regulations, some of which may be, in the short term, justified, but certainly not in the longer term, and certainly not in the way in which they are being implemented. So there's just a great deal to do in this area. And the third area that we are looking at is particularly around crisis governance, because we have seen that in many parts of the world, both at the international level, I'd say the Security Council has been largely missing in this crisis, but also at the national level in many countries, we're seeing that governance is really not where it should be. Leadership is largely lacking, with I think a few very nice examples of where it is working, but so many places it's not. We have launched an online series of dialogues, actually, that if you're interested, have a look on our website on crisis governance. The next one will be on August the 2nd, and it will actually feature Helen Clark as one of our speakers, because we are bringing together both national and international policymakers and practitioners. So it's people of at all levels, including civil society. We share best practices and lessons learned. And I would say that what we are learning from what we have done so far is absolutely the importance of leadership, number one, the importance of public-private partnerships, absolutely essential, the importance of whole of government approaches. This cannot just be looked at in isolation, but also whole of society approaches. And I think we've seen that in New Zealand. I think we've seen that also in Italy. Maybe finally, what I would like to say is that I do think this is a time when we have to keep together. We absolutely do need multilateral approaches, single issue approaches, single government approaches, single country approaches are just not working. And we're seeing that even from the most powerful countries in the world. We need to work together. And of course, the international system is not perfect, but those who would criticize the WHO, I've not worked for WHO, but I've worked very closely with them, and I'm doing so again. I mean, honestly, if we did not have the WHO, I don't know where we would be right now, and we can certainly improve it. But I think it's so important that we support the international efforts, we support the national efforts, and that we finally make certain that when there is a vaccine, that it is a global public good, and that it is equitably distributed and available, and that it is not kept only for those who are the more powerful or the richer. And I think that that is only in the self-interest of all, including the most powerful. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Global Women, for giving us this opportunity. It's really been a pleasure, particularly for me to meet the other members of the panel who I didn't know, apart from, of course, Amanda. Wonderful to see everybody, and thank you very much, Agnes.
Oh, look, kia ora koutou. Firstly, to those that joined us online, thank you, because we had a bit of a mixed audience, but our members that also came online, thank you. There were some questions, but I noticed the really smart panelists have answered as we've gone, and I suspect there's lots of connecting after this. And so what I want to do is, to close our session, I want to say on behalf of Global Women to you, Jan, Karen, Audette, Amanda, Bronwen, and to Sara. We really, really appreciate you taking up your time. And as I sit here and think about it, we need to do this more often. You know, we shouldn't wait for these kind of things to drive us to them. So we look forward to talking to you again in terms of having maybe a more regular kind of look at what's happening globally. Because like I said in the beginning, we can all read about it, but we get a real sense of touch and feel when we listen to you. Look, again, on behalf of us all, thank you. Please stay well, stay safe, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Aloha, everybody.
Yeah, great to connect to everybody.